Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Teacher Talk Tutelage, where we break down various general music topics for fellow music educators and students alike. Today's episode is episode 2, all about teaching rhythms. So, Danton, we're going to be discussing a few different ways of teaching rhythms to music students of all ages today, but we're going to focus on two main ones. And those two systems are basically going to be the number counting system and the Ta and TT system. So, do you want to talk a little bit about what they are or what they do?
Yeah, definitely. So, for the number system, it's pretty much like the most like official formal way to count rhythms. It's the most cut and dry. Like here's beat one, two, three, and four, and then we can get into all of the subdivisions there. And we're going to talk a little more about that later. But basically, breaking it down by numbers of the beats. Talking right away with your students about time signatures and what the top number means, what the bottom number means, how all those things relate. But a lot of really great music educators in the past have come up with sort of alternatives, especially when you're working with younger kids. There's a lot of kind of substitute systems that kind of save you from the more kind of dry grid-like approach of like here's each
Mhm.
beat and here's all the ands, and a lot of times just using kind of fun silly nonsense words can be a lot more effective, especially for your younger kids. I know I myself, as a piano teacher with a lot of younger kids, I kind of save the number system for later. So we'll talk a little more about that. The most famous, I would say, is probably by Kodai, using
Mhm.
the Ta and TT
Mhm.
system, just using Ta for longer rhythms, TT for shorter ones. It's a great way to teach, differences between quarters and eighths. You could even stretch it and use it for halves and quarters. And there's a whole bunch of variants of it that other educators have come up with in the past. I know some of my teachers have different systems. I myself have a couple different ways I like to work around it, which we'll talk about. So I think we should start with the number system. Like let's show like here's like the official formal way you should be counting your music, and then
Mhm.
we can break into like the whole ta TT thing and talk about the alternatives that are out there.
Absolutely. And one of the things you said that I thought really make it kind of describes it perfectly for the number system is the grid-like approach. And that's a good way to describe it too, because it really is like the standard way most musicians, once they've gotten to the point where they're comfortable on their instrument and comfortable with counting, that's how we typically count the majority of the time. But they both have their advantages. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw up a chart on the screen that allows us to take a look at how each of the rhythmic divisions will be counted in the number system and the Ta and TT system side by side. So let me go ahead and put that up there right about now. So as you can see here on this chart, this is what I like to call, and what other people call as well, the rhythm tree. Essentially what this is it's a way of taking a look at how each of your rhythmic divisions break down. We're taking a look at our whole notes, half notes, quarter notes, eighth notes, and 16th notes, and we're not breaking them down into triplets or 32nd notes or 64ths just for sake of sanity for today. But what I wanted to talk about was how the rhythms are counted in each of the different systems. And we'll be working with rhythms in 4/4 essentially, so we can use whole notes. But the way it typically works for the number system is that it goes off of the beats of the measure. Now, I've also gone and put any beats that are part of a longer rhythm in parentheses so that we know that it's not just the starting note, but it lasts for all of the beats as well. As you can see for our whole note, we're looking at 1 and 2, 3, 4 are part of it, but you wouldn't count them out loud, or at least that's not the way I typically teach it. Usually you would count the first one and then account for the rest of that space, either silently or kind of some sort of motion basically to account for that without saying out loud. Because if you would, it sounds like you're speaking all quarter notes. So as you can see, for the whole, we have that half notes, 2 beats apiece, where 2 and 4 would be the beats contained within the ones starting on 1 and 3. Quarters are 1, 2, 3, 4. And when we get down to eighths and 16ths into our subdivisions, this is where the number system, in my opinion, really shines and kind of shows its worth. So down at the eighth note level, we start adding ends. And if you're seeing plus signs, that's on purpose. We don't write out end anymore. That's kind of an older thing. You might find in like the old Rubanks books from the 30s. But essentially, we're just using that plus sign as a stand-in for end. And basically what that is a way of accounting for that extra beat that takes place between each of the beat numbers. And we add to that when we get down to the 16th level by building off of that. And we basically have beats 1 and the end, but then we also had an E in between 1 and end and an after end, but before the start of the next beat. So what I really like about the system is that it builds upon itself everything is very sequentially put together, and you can kind of count on it to have that grid-like precision. But you can also know exactly which beat you're at. If somebody says, okay, we need to start this particular melody on the end of 2 in this measure, you can look for that measure, for that particular beat, and then where it's starting. It's like precise map coordinates. On the opposite side, in the Ta and TT system, this is a system that is much more well designed to help you learn your lengths of rhythms, but not necessarily where you are in a particular measure, which does make it more difficult. You wouldn't hear somebody say, okay, we're going to be on the Ta in this particular measure, because chances are there's 4 of them for you to pick from. But what it does is it helps us to get used to rhythmic divisions without having to necessarily worry about that grid-like precision. It's really just reading and speaking the rhythms as you see them. And Dan, as you mentioned before, this is something that we typically use more for younger learners, and it is a great system for getting them on board with reading rhythms in the first place without having to necessarily make things overly complicated by getting involved in all the numbers and the subdivisions. So, as you can see here, for the whole note and half notes, ones that are typically longer than a quarter note, we take ta, but we just add an extra ah syllable to it for each particular rhythm. So for our whole note, we're looking at ta, ah, 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 or for half notes, ta, ta, ah. And that, in my opinion, and what I've used for teaching in classrooms before, really works for a lot of students, because that way they can account for those extra beats without having to kind of think through them abstractly in their head and realize that, oh, this lasts for this long rather than this just starts on this beat. And when we get down to the quarters, it's all tas. When we get down into the eighths, this is where it changes and it becomes TT. Now, the nice part here is that they're short syllables and it's easy to differentiate between quarters are ta, or halves and whole are longer versions of ta. Eighth notes are TT. That means you can mix and match those rhythms, and it makes it easier for students to be able to differentiate between them. Now, we do have a version for the 16th note level as well. And this is where it differs between different systems. Some have like the Tiri system. Others have the Tika system. There's a whole bunch of different ones for some different systems, which are based off of the same kind of counting methodology for the larger rhythm divisions, but not necessarily the same one for the 16th note level. This is where they tend to diverge a bit. So myself personally, I prefer the numbers, but the tas and TTs are great for teaching younger learners. Danton, thoughts on these?
Yeah, especially a lot of times when I work with my younger piano students, I like to always use clapping as well. If you can clap and vocalize the rhythms simultaneously. And for a lot of our longer rhythms, like half notes and whole notes, in the instance of ta, ah, ah, you clap on the downbeat and then hold your hands together. And I like to use a lot of body motion and gestures to really, especially now in the current days of online teaching with, I'm stuck on a screen with my kids instead of there with them in person. But I like to kind of conduct with my arms and hands of that. I'm still feeling the pulses of those beats, even if I'm not actively playing notes on the piano. So that's really effective. And that the whole clapping to reinforce it also works when you're doing the more traditional numbers system of that idea of, okay, I can clap and vocalize 4 quarters, 1, 2, 3, 4, but I could also do it as one whole, 1, 2, 3, 4. And I usually tend to connect it with my voice too. I try to have no empty space to really help further accentuate that difference between, we're still feeling all these beats. It's just a matter of what are we doing on them and how does that vary from song to song. My piano teacher used another kind of variant of the tika thing. There was we used slow for quarters, and that was pretty much the equivalent of ta. And then for halves and wholes, it would slow, whoa, whoa, whoa. You can vocalize it that way. And then for eighth notes, we did quick, quick, which worked. And then for 16ths, we did tibby, tibby. So, insert simple, easy to say, silly nonsense word. And it's also, it makes the lessons a little more fun, especially with your more creative younger kids. It definitely can be effective, and especially it facilitates good musicianship right away. If you have them vocalizing, clapping, thinking of it internally, externally, playing it on the piano, tapping it on their feet. There's a number of different ways you can reinforce good, solid, steady beat in your students playing. Um, and a lot of that stuff works just as well when you're doing the more traditional number system of, like I said before, clapping and counting, feeling the beats on the piano as you play, and not even just on piano. You could do this on pretty much any instrument,
Mhm.
really. Um, so at least with an exception of wind instruments, because you can't obviously speak while you're playing them, but you can definitely have, if you're teaching like a flute or clarinet student, you can have them go through and speak out the rhythms of their parts rather than play, to
Oh,
make sure they
absolutely.
really have a solid understanding of the rhythm. My band director always said, if you could sing it, you can play it, and I think that's very, very true. So
And I think the same goes true for rhythms as well. And unfortunately, sometimes rhythms kind of get pushed to the wayside a little bit for wind and string players as they're concentrated more on getting the pitch and articulations down. So this is something that's rather integral to their education just as much as anybody else's. Now, you mentioned that your teacher had you use some of the more like ta and tt style syllables as you first started. I actually never learned with them when I was a kid. When I first started out taking lessons on drums, I immediately jumped into using the numbers. So I've always used them because that's what I've always been used to, which is pretty much, I guess, the same for anybody who, they learn a particular way out there. They're partial to what they learn as long as it continues to work for them.
yeah, yeah,
Now,
definitely.
the
I'm
main,
definitely partial to the numbers myself. I like to use that as much as I can, even with some younger students, if possible. It depends on the learner. Every kid is different, and I could have two kids that are the same exact age in the same exact book, and one of them's doing tas and ts and slows and quicks and all this stuff, and the other one is doing numbers. It's a matter of figuring out which way works best for your child.
absolutely. And, one of the things we also wanted to talk about, besides just getting a chance to kind of break down how each of the systems work, is kind of the pros and cons for any educators out there if they're trying to decide what system they want to use for teaching a student, depending on what age. Now, every student is different. Some are going to latch onto it more quickly. Some will find that they gain ground with one system over the other more quickly. So that's really kind of dealer's choice for an educator. But we figured we kind of give a brief overview of those pros and cons just so you can kind of get an idea of what each of them does very well. And some of them we've already mentioned, but I'll just kind of run down what we had here. So on the Ta and TT side, the pros for that is one, it has a very easy learning curve for younger students. Because you're not differentiating beats by what place in the measure, it makes it a lot easier to jump right in to start learning it and reading your rhythms. And the other nice part is the differentiation of syllables for each rhythmic value, which means that if it's a different division, it has a different syllable past a certain point, which makes it easier to kind of keep them separate as you're reading through them. And it also accounts for those longer value rhythms with extended syllables, which we talked about before. On the opposite side of that, though, it doesn't account for time signature at all. And by that, meaning that it doesn't really count for your place in the measure as to what beat it is. So you could still be counting ta, 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 ta for 4/4, or you could be counting 7 of them if you were in 7/4. Not that you're going to be teaching a 6 or 7 year old in 7/4, but I mean, you could for fun, why not?
Well, even
But
if you're just using other time signatures, 3/4, 2/4,
exactly.
6/8, it definitely can lead to a lot of confusion if you're not careful.
Exactly. And the one other part, which we didn't get a chance to kind of touch upon, is the idea that this system kind of has a shelf life for students. After they reach a certain age, and usually I find that to be somewhere around like 8 to 9 years old, maybe even a little bit younger than that, it kind of starts to become corny sounding. Right as students usually get to the point where they don't like having to speak or sing in front of other students, this is usually where that starts to happen. A little bit of that embarrassment factor, and that's usually about the time when it's a good time to switch over to the numbers, in my opinion. Typically somewhere in that 7 to 8 range when they can more comfortably handle that, and the numbers sound a little bit less ridiculous to say out loud. But that's why we tend to use the Ta and TT system for younger students. They latch onto it more quickly. Now, on the numbers side, the pros there, which we've already talked about a few, but it does account for time signature and beat placement. It is like a set of map coordinates on a grid. You can know exactly what place you're in and exactly where to start, which is very helpful as you get into more complex music that you're teaching your students. Another part that we mentioned was that it builds upon itself for smaller divisions of rhythms. So we don't really change the beat numbers, similar to the way the ta and tt change syllables when it goes from one division to a smaller division. We build upon it by adding to it rather than by changing it altogether, which makes it a lot easier to figure out, oh, these divisions land in the same spot for part of these rhythms as the previous larger rhythm. And it's adjustable for compound time signature counting, which is definitely more on the advanced side, but that allows you to change things like, say you're in 6/8, you could count it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or you could count it 1 enda, 2 enda. And that's really nice and adaptable too, because it really means you can change it depending on your circumstances and depending on what you're teaching or what you're playing. However, on the opposite side, and these are a little bit more specific than the ones with the ta and tt, but this does have a steep learning curve, which means that if you're trying to teach this to a student who's 6, 7, 8 years old, you're going to have to definitely go a little bit more slowly to help them get into it and be able to feel comfortable counting each of those beats and knowing their place. There's also a lack of mnemonic devices, which makes differentiating more complex rhythms more difficult. So, in the ta and tt, where we have tas for quarters, tt for eighth notes, and tika tika or tiri tiri or whichever version you're using for sixteenths, we don't have that for the number system. It just builds upon itself. But that also means that part of each of those smaller divisions sounds like a previous larger division. And the last part basically is that, well, you have to worry about making sure that students are comfortable with those smaller divisions and knowing where each of those E's and U's and N's are placed as to not get them backwards. And that can be a little bit tougher for more complex rhythms. All right, so after that long-windedness, what I wanted to get down to for the very nitty-gritty at the end of this, Danton, is kind of our personal recommendations of which one to use, when, why, and how to teach it. So my question to you is, if you had to pick when you were going to use these systems, and when and why and how, what would you do?
As is the answer to so many other questions that get pitched to me, the biggest answer for me is always context. It depends.
The lawyer answer, that's a good one.
for me as a teacher, like I said before, it depends on the student. It depends on the piece. Like I said, I had an 8-year-old just a couple of weeks back where we were doing more on the kind of ta tt side at first, but then she wanted to get into a specific pop song that had a whole bunch of different 16th note subdivision permutations. So it's like, so I decided for her lessons to take, a good 2 or 3 sessions worth of let's switch over to the number system. Let's talk about that. Let's go through each possible, let's break down how the 16ths work. And, especially doing the lessons online, I was able to kind of, chart the whole thing out in a nice big Zoom screen share and label everything and then just break in all the different. So let's do all 4 16ths. Let's take out the end. Let's take out the E. Let's take out the Let's get you really comfortable vocalizing every different possible rhythm that you're going to see in these melodies of the song you're trying to learn. And it had a really nice payoff. For us, it took a good couple of lessons to really just focus on the rhythms itself. But once she officially converted to that number system, she was able to soar with the piece, and she got through page after page, no problem. So it depends. It depends on what kind of music you're trying to teach, what the subject matter is. It depends on the age and maturity of your student. You might have an 8-year-old that's going to jump right in on the numbers thing right away, and they're going to just take it and roll with it. You might have some 9, 10, 11-year-olds that just stick with the kind of nonsense babble stuff because it works, and you just use it as long as it's reliable. So yeah, I can't really give a clear black and white use this in this situation and use that in the other, because it varies so much. Like I said, I could have 2 kids the same age in the same book, and I could be teaching them 2 totally different ways.
Gotcha. And I always like the answer, it depends, because I always call it the lawyer answer, but really,
yeah, I hate it. I hate giving it. I always feel so bad. It feels like such an easy cop out, but it really is the nature of teaching music.
And when you're teaching private students, everybody learns at a different pace, and different things are comfortable for different students at different times. Mm-hmm. I know, coming from the public school side of it, that obviously things have to be a little bit more homogenous in terms of our approach, because we would like to have the time to teach 25 different times when students are able to get that to 25 different students, but it's just not really feasible on a regular basis. However, Myself personally, I would say I've seen the T's and T's used probably up until about probably about the end of second grade. Myself personally, I feel like they are very helpful up until the time when students are comfortable with being able to group things in numerical order. So you can kind of understand like the sequential concept of, all right, these beats go in this order, and then they can kind of break them down. So about the time they start learning a little bit about their fractions, and by the time they can start grouping by numerical order comfortably, I think that's usually about the time I'm comfortable switching them over to the numbers. And it's a little bit more of like, all right, here's some more complicated rhythms that you're now learning. Now's the time to switch, because no longer will the T's and T's really help you exactly with what you're working on, and now's a good time for you to switch over, and here's what we'll be using from now on. Now, I know that sounds a little bit more uniform of an approach, but I find that most students, you'll basically have a good idea of when they're ready to move over to that number system. And I typically find it somewhere around like the 7 to 8 age range most of the time. Some students learn with numbers more quickly, and usually those students tend to be percussionists, just because percussionists eat, sleep, and drink rhythms all like throughout their entirety as musicians, and as they're learning. Just because rhythms are such an integral part of what we do, it's a little bit different. Like I said, I learned with numbers first, and that was kind of how it was because I started off taking percussion lessons. But I would say, again, it depends, but I usually have a general idea of when a student should switch over from one to the other. Well, Dan, any last thoughts for this particular topic?
No, I would say that pretty much wraps things up. So, for those of you viewing, as always, we hope that you find this information helpful, useful, whether you use it as a teacher in your lessons with your students, or if you're a student scouring the depths of the internet online to find us, for more kind of tutorial videos like this on how basic things are done in music. We hope you find it helpful. And if you did, as always, be sure to like, post a comment, subscribe to our channel, Pansy Podcast Productions. You'll find all sorts of teacher talk content there. And that's it.
I believe so. Yeah. So like Danton said, we hope this video is helpful for those that are out there, looking for a way to teach this to their students. And like he also said, like, comment, and subscribe. We always love to hear what different teachers are using for their students. And our goal, as always, is to start a discussion for the music education field in general. So if you have any thing you'd like to share with us about how you usually teach counting, feel free, please, to share on our Facebook page or on our YouTube videos. And we'll see you in the next one.